Hi, this is Lucinda Williams, and you're listening to Walking the Floor.
I'm walking the floor over you.
Walking the floor.
I'm walking the floor. Walking the floor over you.
Hola, senors and senoritas, and welcome to Walking the Floor. First things first, ladies and gentlemen, let me wish you a very happy President's Day. Today is President's Day, and I actually looked at my calendar the day that I taped this ahead of when I was posting it, and I remembered the holiday. It's never happened, so I'm patting myself on the back. If it's President's Day today, does that make it Donald Trump Day? God, I hope not. I hope not. Let's not do that, people. What's happening in your world? I'll tell you what's happening in my world. Too much. I got too much on my plate right now, but it's all good stuff. Don't forget to get out there and buy tickets for my tour. That's coming up here pretty soon in March. Some of the shows, well, I think they're all on sale, and I made like Facebook events for all of them. So if you need ticket links, go on Facebook and look it up. They're all there. Some of them are doing okay. Some of them are need a little help. And I'm talking about you, Ketchum, Idaho. I'm talking about you, Spokane, Washington. We need to get some people to those shows, man. That's a long way to drive. We can't play to 4 people. Let's make it happen. And you know, coming soon, my new record's coming out, West Coast Town. So we'll be doing all those songs ahead of that. And I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say this ahead of this happening, but Noisy is going to premiere my video for West Coast Town, I think tomorrow, Tuesday. The 21st, I want to say. So go to noisy.vice.com tomorrow, and you should be met with a beautiful guerrilla-style shot video exclusive for the video for West Coast Town. Okay, let's talk about our good friends out there at Zounds.com. Now, thanks to Zounds.com, this here podcast is free. So think about all those zillions and trillions and kabillions of dollars that you're saving in free entertainment costs week after week, and take that money you're saving and head over to Zounds.com and get that brand new Marshall stack, or maybe that Fender Stratocaster that you've been putting off because you thought you couldn't afford it, but now you can, because Zounds.com, they're going to beat any price you get anywhere else on the internet, man. Let's get over there. Zounds.com. Let's go. Let's get to the interview. Okay, so I've been doing this here podcast for a few years now, and over the years, there's been you have your master list of dream interviews, dream artists that you really hope that someday you get a chance to talk to. And Lucinda Williams has been right at the top of that list the whole time. And we've been trying to get her for a long time, and we finally did. We got her this week. We've been bugging her publicist for years, and all the stars finally lined up. And I got a call from Davis, who books the podcast, saying, hey, listen, you can interview Lucinda Tuesday night. It's like, boom, done, I'll take it. And I didn't realize right off the bat, oh, wait a minute, that's Valentine's Day. So I had to go to my wife, and I said, honey, do you mind if instead of taking you out to a nice romantic dinner on Valentine's Day, that I go hang out with Lucinda Williams and interview her instead? And my wife, God bless her, she's a Lucinda Williams fan, so she was like right on board. Oh, no, absolutely, babe, you got to do that. So that's what I did. I spent my Valentine's Day interviewing Lucinda Williams, and more importantly, she spent her Valentine's Day letting me interview her, and she was so cool. Went up to her house. Her husband, Tom, answered the door. I walk in there. I start setting up my stuff. And I'm like nervous because, I'm a huge Lucinda Williams fan. And she's just an amazing songwriter and performer and all that stuff. So, and it's hard. It's hard sometimes with people who have long careers and lots of albums and, somebody that you really, really respect. You don't want to screw up the interview, and you don't want to ask the wrong thing, and you don't want to forget to ask the right thing. And, just all that stuff's kind of weighing on you. And as I'm plugging in my microphones and getting everything set up, she came upstairs and walked in, and she just couldn't have been any nicer. She made me feel right at home, and we, as you're about to find out, we had a nice long talk. I finally, in my head, I kind of went, God, we've been talking for a really long time here. I better get out of here before I wear out my welcome. So let's get to it. This is Lucinda Williams on Walking the Floor.
Running and chasing after.
First off, thank you for doing this on Valentine's Day. I'm so sorry I didn't.
No,
when we booked it, I didn't realize it was Valentine's Day
That's okay.
until after the fact.
Yeah, it's not a big deal. I mean, we didn't have any plans or anything.
Oh, right on.
Yeah.
Did you have fun the other night at that Tom Petty gig? The Music
It
Cares
was,
thing?
yeah.
You sounded great.
Yeah, it was. Thank you. It was fun, but it was pretty hectic. There were so many people running around. It was this huge production.
I know.
Because I'd done the one for Neil Young, a few years back, and this one was, and we had to come the day before for rehearsal, and then, get there like earlier the next day and go through the song again. And of course, now you've been through it a couple of times, and then we finally get to the actual thing, and I make a mistake and
yeah, nobody
come in
notices.
too soon.
Nobody notices. We had a good time the other night too. We played.
Oh yeah, right. You played with Oh my God, he's so great.
Yeah, that was fun. I felt like we were like, Slayer at a folk concert
Yeah,
or something.
right,
yeah. Like, but it was fun. We always kind of fill that role at those things.
Yeah.
Anyway, you want to just jump in and talk about stuff? I mean, I don't know if you probably never. I'm assuming you've never listened to my podcast.
I haven't heard it yet.
I kind of do like this is your life,
Okay.
Just go through the years, and if there's anything you don't want to talk about, we can not talk about it too. But I figure we might as well just start from the start, which would be like where you grew up. Because I know you moved around a bunch.
Yeah.
As a kid, your dad was a poet, right?
Right. He was a writer and a college professor, later in life, a college professor. I mean, he did everything from, selling tires at Sears and Roebuck, in the early 60s, and selling, door-to-door salesman for Harcourt Brace and Company,
Was that like as a struggling poet before he became a teacher?
The funny thing is that, he had always been writing, but, when he started college, one of his advisors, as they used to do back in the day, you had an advisor who would advise you, as to,
like what you're cut out for in life?
Yeah, what you're cut out for. And they said, Mr. Williams, we don't think you're cut out for the arts. We think you should go into the sciences. So he actually got a degree in biochemistry.
Really?
And he taught biochemistry in the early years. But all the time he was writing and meeting other poets. And, he ended up having a real good close friendship with the writer John Chardy and the Southern writer Flannery O'Connor. And, so he had these people who were encouraging him along the way. And eventually he started teaching freshman English and then creative writing. He kind of worked his way up. But he never actually had a degree in English.
I mean, what was that like growing up for you in that environment surrounded by writers and poets and academics? I mean, was it... Did that make it easier for you to write, or did that make it daunting?
No, it actually made it easier. A little bit of both. Because my dad could be a little critical at times. I mean, and I looked up to him.
I read that you would send him your songs.
Yeah,
like even
later.
In professional life, many years later.
Yes,
right.
That was later. But I always wanted to please him. I always looked up to him. We had a really close bond from the time I was born because my mother was suffering from illness issues, and so my dad kind of filled in there, and he and I just really bonded in a real special way. And I started writing little poems and little short stories and things from the time I was about 6 years old, and I was just always one of those you know,
Creative
kind
kids.
of arty kids, you know, who like to write and draw and
Sure.
everything and stuff. And so then eventually, little bit by little bit, I started, you know, trying to write songs and stuff.
Like how old? Like when did you actually start playing
I
music?
started taking guitar lessons and playing when I was about 12 and a half, which was in 1965. And this guy who had a rock band, my dad was teaching at LSU in Baton Rouge, and this guy who had a rock band would come over to the house once a week and just, you know, I would tell him what song I wanted to learn. So I didn't learn how to read or write music or anything, you know, and I would just say, I want to learn this song. And it might have been, now keep in mind, I was 12, so I was really into Joan Baez and Pierre Paul and Mary, you know. So one of them might have been Puff the Magic Dragon,
Sure.
you know. And so he would show me the chords and the picking technique for that particular song, and then I would practice that all week. Then the next week we'd learn another song. So I kind of built up my little repertoire and learned little. And I started out playing with a thumb pick, and, you know, and finger picking.
So folk music was like your entry point?
Yeah, because this was the mid-'60s, so, you know, it was the height of the folk thing.
Right.
And, you know, Joan Baez and Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, and all this. And I had this book called Folk Song USA that was, you know, by John and Alan Lomax. And, you know, so once I learned to play a little bit, you know, then I was able to accompany myself. And I would just spend all my time during my teenage years, you know, because I couldn't read music or anything, but I'd try to find, I would get the record album, and then I'd go to the music store and try to find the songbook that had some of the songs that were on the album, and I would get all excited, because then I had the lyrics, and I had the chords, and I could, you know. And so that's just kind of how I learned over the years, you know. And,
Was there a point when rock and roll crept in?
oh, yeah. Well, you know, then over the next few years, you know, 66, it started out with, well, first I discovered Bob Dylan in 96, that same year, 65, because a student of my dad's, and here again was the cool thing, because, you know, we were in that academic world, so, you know, I would get turned on to music that that his students were listening to.
Right.
A lot of the times, which in other worlds I might not have been.
Sure.
You know, so I remember one day a student of my dad's came over to the house because they had a meeting about something, and he brought in Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited, and he's all excited. You know, back
You
then,
gotta hear this.
It was like that.
Right.
You know,
I mean, I remember that from my childhood. Like,
Yeah.
it's different now. I see it with my kids. It's very different now. But like when I was a kid, listening to a record was like a social
it was
activity in
huge.
itself.
It
You know?
right, and you would get together. I remember when the Beatles' White Album came out, and a few of us got together at a friend's house, and it was a whole big ritual. You know, put the album on and listen, and it was a whole big thing. You know. Because they didn't have social media back then. I guess
Sure.
that was the thing. So it was all. But anyway, so that's how I discovered Bob Dylan. He set the album down in the living room, went in to talk with my dad, and I put it on, and I went, wow. And I hadn't heard him before until that album. And then, of course, I went back and checked out his earlier things, but.
Were you already writing your own songs at that point?
Well, I mean, you know, maybe a couple of little ones. I wrote this little song called The Wind Blows. I think that was my... There was no double entendre, you know, intended, you know, when I was that age. But it was just kind of like...
Like, do you ever go back and listen to those songs that your really early stuff and like, oh, wow, that wasn't too bad?
I mean, this is really early. This would have been like, you know, when I was 13 or something. And... You know, there was a song on the radio back then called Where Have All the Flowers Gone? You know, where have all the flowers gone? You know, just these beautiful little melodies. And there was another one called Today. Today, while the blossoms still cling to the vine. So there were all these kind of like folk pop artists that came out, you know, like the Sandpipers and all of this. And you know, it was kind of like folk music became, you know, like
Popular.
kind of popular.
Mainstream to a certain extent.
Yeah.
Like, so when did you start? Did you ever like have high school bands and like what were your early
No, I just started just on my own like that, and
playing
you know,
in coffee houses?
Yeah,
that
and a
whole
bunch
thing?
of my friends played guitars and stuff, and you know, I really got. But to answer your question before about the rock thing, so I really got into Lovin' Spoonful when I was about 14. We moved to New Orleans, and I remember I really got into them. And Buffalo Springfield was a huge influence and inspiration, and you know, and then suddenly, I mean, all this amazing music was coming out.
Right.
You know, it was, and the Doors. I was really into the Doors. By the time, this would have been when I was about 15, 16.
Right.
You know,
Did you get to see any of those bands live?
my dad took me and a girlfriend of mine to see Jimi Hendrix, which I barely remember because back then they didn't have, big enough places so he was playing on this stage in the middle of basically a football field or something.
Right,
We're on these
right.
bleachers.
And they didn't really have like PA technology.
They didn't have all that,
Yeah.
so they didn't have the video screens, and all that. But, I vaguely remember that.
I love old footage, like when you watch footage from Altamont or whatever.
Yeah.
Compared to like what a festival or any big concert would be now. Like the stage is teeny. There's like people kind of sitting right in front. It's not crazy.
Yeah.
The energy is kind of low compared. Now everything's like, all the time. It was so different.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It just was more. I hate to use the word mellow, but it just was so much. It just seemed much smaller.
Well, people were, taking, smoking pot and, taking psychedelics and stuff.
Right.
So that kind of, it was, I remember going to see, I spent a little, now once I was able to leave home, like when I was about, 19 or 20 or something, I immediately made my way out to California and, spent a little time in the Bay Area. And
But when you left home, were you like going out to try to make it as a musician? Had you already decided like that's what your path was?
Yeah, at some point I just knew, well, the thing is my dad, and rightly so, was concerned about me having something to fall back on. So he wanted me to get a degree in something so I could have, and he was right, because if I hadn't made it in music, I didn't have any trade.
Right.
I mean,
it's fun. I like hearing that. Like my dad was a teacher as well, and was kind of radical in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
in some ways, you couldn't get the
more
old school out of him. You
Yes,
know what I mean? And like
see, that's how my dad was.
Yeah.
He was very open-minded, politically and all other ways, and artistically. But then.
But like when I flunked
He
out of
was
high school,
very
he was not happy. He was,
Right.
and it was the same kind of thing. Like, what are you going to do with your life?
He had certain traditions, and he appreciated ritual, and so.
Right.
But yeah, that was because of what he had to struggle along with, as a writer and everything.
When did,
doing
just
all
out of
these
curiosity,
other-
at what point in, like, how old were you when his career as a poet really, kind of began to happen?
Probably, well, I remember going, there was a writers' conference that was really big in Vermont called Breadloaf. It was a Breadloaf Writers' Conference, and I remember we went there in 1968 and 1969 because my dad had been invited. It was kind of like a music conference thing, except writers. Like they would have workshops, and the writer who was running it was John Chardy. And so he invited my dad, to come. And younger poets would come and, sit in on these workshops. And, the poets who were there as guests would give readings and that kind of thing. So it was probably like, during my teen, like it kind of just gradually, happened over the years. I mean, it wasn't like he was this big famous writer, but, he earned a lot of respect, from other writers. And eventually we moved to Fayetteville, Arkansas, where he achieve tenure, and so then we didn't move anymore. But and that was in 1971. So up until then, when he was a young college professor, as is usually the case, you teach for a year or two here, then move to another college, so consequently we lived, but we were always in college towns, so I got really used to that.
So you were always with like the hip bohemian crowd.
Yes, and I identified with it a lot. I
Yeah.
loved, the academic feeling and the people who'd come over to the house and, discussing, art and politics and everything. And people like, eventually when we settled in Fayetteville, my dad started the MFA program in creative writing. So, there were a lot of visiting writers who would come into town and, that kind of thing. And because the writing world is pretty small, really, And so, like John Cleland Holmes was there for a while. He had he would teach for 6 months out of the year there in Fayetteville, and he was one of the beat poets. He wrote this novel called Go, and Charles Bukowski came through.
Oh, wow.
But I wasn't.
How was that?
I wasn't there, but I heard all about it.
Right.
And in fact, because see, what would happen would be one of a poet would come into town, give a reading, and then there'd be a party afterwards.
Right.
And let me tell you, these parties were, these writers knew how to party,
Right.
And it
was Bukowski like embraced by the academic world? He seems like he would be a bit of an outsider to that.
Yeah. It depends on who you were talking to.
Sure.
But anyway, the after reading party would either be at another writer's, Jim Whitehead's house, or my dad's house, so
they'd all cut loose.
I was there for some of that stuff, and
Right.
these guys, smoked heavily. Most of them were cigarette smokers, and drank the hard stuff, bourbon and scotch, into the night, and
Yeah.
But it was incredible for me, a teenage girl, to be, and. My dad would say, go get your guitar, honey, and come play a couple of songs, and I would play,
Wow. Were those your first experiences, like playing, playing in front of other people?
Yeah, probably,
Was that a tough
Well,
room, or was that
before-
where they just like, yeah?
Well, before that, when we were in New Orleans, I played a little bit in little coffee houses and stuff, and, so, but, I remember being at one of those gatherings, and sometimes there were big parties, and sometimes there were just gatherings. And John Cleland Holmes would, because he was a big jazz aficionado too, and my dad was really into jazz besides country. He loved Coltrane.
So he was into country too?
Yeah.
I was going to ask when that started to creep into
Hank
your...
Williams, and then, but he was also into Chet Baker and the Coltrane Ballads album.
Right.
Yeah. And so I would get encouragement, though, from these other writer friends of my dad's who would, say, basically the message was, they could see that I wasn't there yet, but they would say, just keep going because you have a lot of soul.
Right.
That was the, kind of the message.
Keep hanging it out there.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm curious, why then when you moved, out of your dad's house, or went off into the world to make it, why California and not Nashville?
Well, I actually did go to Nashville at one point because it was 1972, I think. Why did I go to California? I don't remember.
Because didn't you spend some time in Texas too before?
I think that was 1974, but there was a little period there, like right before I moved to Austin, where, I don't know, it's probably somebody I met was out in San Francisco and said, come out, or something. I don't know. You know how that goes when you're that age.
You're going to the Golden State to make it.
And I would just go wherever my feet would take me, And back then, you know, people, you got rides off of ride boards and stuff, and, you know,
Right.
there was a lot more trust.
Wait,
and everything.
I'm sorry, what's a ride board?
Well, that's when, like, you know, people would put up little notices that say, I'm looking for somebody to ride with me. I'm going to drive from this city to this
Oh,
city.
okay, yeah.
And
For
you
kids
just
listening, it's an analog
share
version
gas.
of Craigslist.
Yes, exactly. You would share the gas, and, you know,
okay.
they would look for somebody to,
Right.
you know, go with them. And so I did that. Well, that's how I got from Arkansas to California. Was with this guy, and he was real nice and everything. But my dad had gotten to know Tom T. Hall. He was drawn to Tom T. Hall's music because Tom T. wrote in a way that no other country artist was writing.
Sure.
I mean, he was just, you know, a real writer. And so he and my dad started corresponding. Anyway, long story short, I was a guy who played in Tom T.'s band. Somehow or another, I got asked to go out to Nashville and audition for Opryland.
Oh, wow.
And I stayed at, the guy who played bass was Tom T. Hall. I stayed with his wife and kids at their house. And I went and auditioned for Opryland, and of course I didn't make it, you know. So that was probably about...
And Opryland's like the theme park
Yeah.
of the Grand Ole Opry,
Yeah.
right. So what were you been like in the house band or whatever?
Well, I don't know. They have these little, you know, it's kind of like, what's that one that they have in Missouri or whatever? It's like a theme park, like you said, like Dolly.
Oh, like Dollywood or Branson.
And they have, Branson.
Right.
You know, where they
Yeah.
have little acts they put on, or I don't know, whatever
sure.
it is, you know.
Yeah.
And
Luckily, you
weren't-
didn't make it.
Yeah, they weren't looking for someone the likes of me, you know. So, anyway, it's kind of a big blur, you know,
Right.
but I can't remember if I went to Nashville first and then California or the other way around, but at any rate, you know.
So when did
That's-
the music start to really take off for you? Like, what led to you getting your
Yeah.
first record deal?
Well, that would have been... Okay, so I ended up in Austin and Houston back and forth between 1974 and 1984. And, you know...
Were guys like, you know, Steve Earle and Guy Clark and Towns and those guys still around in that scene?
I met Guy, but, you know, I met him in the early 70s when I went through there briefly, and then in the early 80s, you know. But, you know, there was this kind of boys club thing. I mean, you know, it took a long time for me to get accepted on a certain level, you know.
Right.
And I was kind of shy and everything too, so I don't think I met Steve Earle actually until about 1986 or something.
Oh, wow,
But
so a lot later.
I remember, you know, I saw Towns and he would come in and out of town, or, you know, Austin, Houston, and, you know, he was kind of, I don't know, I was a little intimidated by him, you know. I mean, I was astounded by his talent, but, you know, he kind of talked in riddles a little bit, you know, and he was fucked up a lot of the time, and, you know, there was just, I mean, there was a lot of drinking and all that going on back then.
Sure.
You know, and, I mean, it was the same thing when I first met, you know, well, now I'm going ahead of myself, but, you know, I was so intimidated by Steve Earle, you know, because he was just, you know, Lulu, what are you doing? You know, like that kind of thing.
Was he like
it's
that then
Texas
too?
thing.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's that Texas thing. And Guy Clark was the same way. He would just, I
Take
would see him
over
and I'd
a
be
room.
like, oh, God. And he'd come up and he'd go, what are you doing, man? Are you high? You know, you want to get fucked up? You know, I mean, it was just that kind of teasing thing all the time.
Right.
Just like
Right.
not straight ahead. It just was wasn't what I was used to. And part of it was that kind of machismo thing.
Right,
And the
sure.
whole, you know. But I remember like when I first moved out to LA, so that's what I was going to say. That was kind of, you know, the time I spent in Texas, though, was, you know, I was real fortunate to have been able to be there and do that, because that's kind of where I cut my teeth. You know, there were tons of places to play and in front of little audiences, and I, you know, kind of started building up a little following, but nobody was thinking about the business part of things. You know, that wasn't even in my head. You know, I didn't have a manager, I didn't have anything.
Right.
And then some friends invited me to come out to LA and San Francisco in 85 or 84 and play. And there was something in the back of my head. I just thought, it's time to leave Texas. I'm probably going to go. Plus, I was in a relationship that I needed to get out of. You know, that has a lot to do with where I was, when, and why.
Right.
You know,
right.
Has a
Either
lot.
going to relationships or leaving them.
Yeah, it would be like, oh, I met this guy and he's out in California, so I'm going to go out there. And
Right.
then, you know, but so it was the guy thing mixed with, you know, the music thing.
Sure.
So that was pulling me in all different directions, you know.
Yeah.
And
I mean, at that point, were you still kind of more playing like folk music?
yeah,
Or,
well, you know, it's kind of by default, because I was always into, you know, I loved Jim Morrison and, you know, the Allman Brothers and Cream, you know, ZZ Top and all that. But, you know, because I just played guitar by myself, I didn't have a band yet or anything. So I kind of I mean, that was just, you know, sort of was the singer-songwriter thing. You know,
right,
whatever,
yeah, sure.
You know.
You know, I'm curious why your first record, for somebody who's such a you know, amazing songwriter and renowned songwriter now, why your first record was all covers.
Well, that's a good question. The reason is I don't think I was number one. I wasn't real secure about my songs at that point, and the other thing was I thought, well, you know, this is folkways. This is because I knew what folkways was.
Right.
You know, from the early 60s.
Sure.
And mid 60s. You know, we used to have this 10-inch, I don't know if you've ever seen them, but it's the old albums where they were 10-inch, but they were a full album, but and the folkways, it was this hard cardboard that the albums would be in.
Yes, I actually have.
You know what I'm talking about?
That. I have a copy of that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like that nice box.
There was an album called Songs to Grow On, volumes 1 and 2. It was all Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie kids songs.
Right.
You know, and a friend of the family's, you know, I got turned on to that. So, you know, even before I started playing and way before I started writing songs, like, I was aware of the importance of folk music and the tradition of American music and, you know, all of that. And, you know, so it was this like big deal to me. I got this, you know, through a friend of mine I'd met from when we were living in New Orleans, and he had moved to New York. I can't believe I can't even remember his name. His name was Jeff Ampolsk, and he had done this record for Folkways called God, Guts, and Guns. And we were talking on the phone, and, you know, he said, well, I can probably get, you know, you can do an album for Folkways too. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, I'll just send him a cassette tape and, you know. So I did that. They sent me back a 1-page contract and $250, you know.
Non-recoupable signing bonus.
Yeah. And,
or fully
you know,
recoupable signing bonus.
Because they didn't really, you know, it didn't really matter if you went out in the field and recorded it or on your back porch or whatever,
right,
you know, I mean,
right.
because it was folkways.
Sure.
So they weren't considered about, you know, worried about the quality or anything like that. But I'm thinking, well, you know, I'm going to do all kind of more traditional songs and this kind of, you know, because it's folkways records. And so I think it was partly that, partly, you know, I wasn't really still thinking of myself as I'm a songwriter, you know. I hadn't really found my voice yet, I guess. But then the second Folkways album I did, I got $500. And that one was recorded at Sugar Hill Studios in Houston.
Now, wasn't there something, I think I read something about that like the after you left, the producer stuck drums all over the whole thing
Yeah,
against your wishes?
it didn't have drums on
Yeah.
it. You know, I was still like, I hadn't been playing with the band, so I wasn't used to playing with the drummer. So it was just all, guitar, bass,
Yeah.
stuff. There were these guys in Houston when I was living there. They used to back me up sometimes on bass and guitar. They also backed up Towns, and they backed up Light and Hopkins.
Oh, wow.
And the guitar
Solid.
player was Mickey White. And he was just this amazing, guitar player guy. And the bass player's name was Rex Bell. But he spelled it Wrecks,
Right.
And they had their own thing called the Hemorrhage Mountain Boys. Spelled Hemmer, Ridge, which was this kind of comical thing they did. Anyway, so they were on the album, and then we had a couple other people. So we recorded it in about 3 days, and so I came back to listen to the final thing, and Mickey Moody, who was the engineer, had brought this drummer in and which isn't a big deal. Now when you listen, you can't even tell, but
Right.
I was flabbergasted. I was completely, what?
You can't do that.
I mean, well, it was the whole thing that he didn't ask, and he just did,
Right,
again.
right, yeah.
The Texas machismo thing, whatever. I'm the innocent sort of little
Right.
girl artist, and,
I mean, that is an interesting thing because, you can't, ignore the fact that this genre or sort of the music world that you live in has been a white male dominated
Yeah,
industry. It
absolutely.
continues to be today,
Yeah,
which I
absolutely.
imagine you had to fight for your
Yeah.
place in that.
Yeah, I didn't really think of it that was what was happening at the time until I look back, but because people ask me that a lot, did you have to deal with, sexism? Yes, I did, but not any more so than, women in the workplace and working at companies where they don't get paid as much and everything. It was hard. That wasn't really the issue. The issue more was comments like, you're pretty good for a girl. That kind of thing.
Right.
And one time I was trying to get a gig at this place in Austin called The Hole in the Wall. And it was right on Guadalupe. It's still there. And the guy who ran it, said, yeah, I'll give you a gig this month. So I was walking by one day and I saw the calendar and it was already all filled up. So I approached him about it. I said, what, you said you'd give me a gig this month. And he said, well, I've already got enough chick singers, for this month. So, that kind of thing.
Right. We've hit our quota.
But I just kind of looked at it like that's just part of the deal.
Right.
Whatever. In the same way that what set me apart from other, folky kind of singer-songwriter people back then was, I would play anywhere.
Right.
In front of any kind of audience, and it didn't matter, if they started talking or chatting or something. I didn't get all freaked out. Certain artists I knew who did, because they were so sensitive. I was like, everybody be quiet. The whole
Sometimes I actually like it when there's when you're doing an acoustic gig and there's a little chatter. 'Cause
I know, me
it takes
too.
the edge
It's
off.
terrifying
Totally.
otherwise. And so I already saw myself kind of I'm not a folkie. I'm not.
Right.
That's not my headset.
Right.
That's not where my head is.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to learn what to do to get people's attention.
Right.
So already that set me, but you couldn't tell because I was playing guitar and singing. But, I knew artists who would, get upset if people were talking, or they would just tear down the whole thing and just storm off or whatever,
And, what would you do if you didn't have the crowd's attention?
Just keep playing,
Right.
and
write
then I
better
would go
songs.
home. Over the years, something in my head said, "Fucking figure it out,"
Right.
and that pushed me to be. It was a combination of things that pushed me, but I wanted to be as good as Bob Dylan.
Right.
That was. I'll just say that unabashedly.
Right.
I'm not embarrassed to say it.
Sure.
When I first heard him, I went, And I was
I
only
wanna do
12
that.
years. That's what I want to do,
Right.
you know. And so I had that, and then, you know, I wanted my dad, you know, I wanted to please my dad and show him that I could do it, and, you know, it was just a combination of things, but it's that drive.
Right.
And, you know, I used to think, you know, if you had, like, talent was enough.
Right.
And it blew my mind when I started meeting artists later on, because I always used to say, you know, if I ever make it, I'm going to help other artists, you know. And I would get to know, you know, these artists who were just brilliant. But, you know, they just didn't have that drive.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes even
And-
it's just even beyond that. It's like
It's
sometimes you
just-
have the drive, but it's just the wrong combination of people.
Right.
There's so
Well,
many
that's true,
things
too.
that lie between
Yeah.
the artist and success.
true.
You know that the
Yeah.
artist has no control over. You know.
Yeah, that's
But then
true.
if the artist doesn't have the drive or the perseverance, then
This was
it'll
more
never
about,
happen.
the kind of artist who, you know, just, I don't know, they have opportunities and don't really take advantage
Right,
of them,
right.
you know.
Yeah, I always say that. Like with the people that where I grew
Yeah.
up, like I wasn't the best guitar player in town
Yeah.
by any means, not even close. But I don't know. I just
But
went,
you had a goal,
right.
and you had a dream.
A lot of
you
guys
know.
just didn't want it.
Well, that's the thing. I started seeing that, you know, way later on, and it blew my mind because I would say, well, what else are you going to do? I mean, you know, yeah, you know, I mean, I didn't understand it. I didn't
Right.
get it. I mean, you know.
I liked those years. I never, when I was young and slogging it out in a van tours and
Yeah,
playing
I did
crummy
that.
clubs. Like I never looked at it as like
But-
as paying dues. I just thought, yeah,
Me too. This is
playing a
what we
gig.
have to do. You
Yeah.
know, this is part of the thing.
Yeah.
You know, you just
Yeah,
keep
yeah.
moving along until it just gets a little bit better, a little bit, you
Right.
know. But I mean, some people just can't seem to get through that hump,
Sure.
or they don't want to tour all the time.
Right,
You know,
right.
I took a guy out with me who I think is fucking brilliant, but he hated touring.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, I understand that, but what else are you going to do? You know, I mean, he didn't have any other trade. You know, I
Yeah,
look
yeah,
at it.
yeah.
See, I still say trade,
Yeah.
like
right.
the old
Right.
days.
Right. Yeah.
But that goes back to my dad saying you need to stay in school,
Yeah.
you know, because if this doesn't work, you're screwed.
Right.
And I knew that.
I mean, I don't know about you, but I still feel like,
Yeah.
God, I hope this works out. You
I
know what I
know,
mean? I'll
right?
probably feel like that until I die.
No,
like,
me too.
It's all going to go away at some
You know
point.
what? That's the best way to look at things. Remember at the Tom Petty thing when they were showing little clips of the interviews, and it was from whatever year, and he was saying, you know what? I'm just happy I have the gig, still have the gig.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was
yeah.
right at the end of this little clip of him
Yeah.
being interviewed, and I loved that. I
Yeah.
just thought, that's why I love him.
Right.
That's why people love him.
Sure.
Because he still has that thing.
Yeah.
Like you're talking about.
Yeah. It's almost like you're still trying to get
He's
there.
still
you know?
got it.
Yeah.
You have to have it. But, you know,
Yeah.
if that goes away, that's it. You know, you got to have that. You know, it's kind of that. My dad used to call it a sense of wonder. Like never lose your sense of wonder.
Right.
You know how people get
And it's
jaded
hard in
and
this
cynical.
business. It's hard in this
very
business.
hard.
I think you can get it's. I mean, I'm as cynical and jaded as the next guy with a lot of stuff involving what we all do for a living.
Yeah.
But then there's still like I still love to pick up my guitar every
Yeah.
day and see what that does. You know what I mean? That's the part that you have to
Right.
keep kind of innocent
gotta
in a
keep
way.
that.
You know. Okay, so
Okay.
so you got your albums on Folkways, and then eventually you get
Yeah.
a record deal like with a major label and all that.
So-
like I'm curious at that point. You know, this is all before there were terms like alt country and
Yeah.
Americana. Nobody said that back then.
Yeah, right.
I don't think. But so were you like trying to, did you consider yourself a part of like mainstream country music?
No.
Is
never.
that sort of the
I never consider myself a part of that mainstream country music. I more wanted to like. I mean, I loved country music, and I love country music.
Right.
You know, and it definitely inspired me, and it was part of the whole mashup. You
Right.
know,
Yeah, yeah.
country and blues and rock and folk rock.
And you had some hits in mainstream country
Well,
covered,
that's
like your
because-
songs being covered by some other artists, right?
Well,
Yeah.
that's just kind of one of those sort of fluke things, you know.
Were
I
you
mean,
writing for them, or were they covering?
No, they just
they just liked your songs.
See,
and-
that's the thing. This was when I very first. I think it was when I moved. I went out to LA. I came out to LA in late '84, and I got this development deal with Sony Records, which meant I don't even know if they still do those anymore, but you know, they would basically, you know, you would get sort of a salary for 6 months. You'd have enough money to live on and pay the bills and just write songs and then go in and demo the songs. And then the label would decide if they were going to sign you or not.
Right.
So, at this, you know, right before that, I've been playing around LA. So, you know, went out there and just started, you know, doing my usual thing, playing wherever I could, opening up for everybody, you know.
Like who were the other artists that were around town that you were playing with?
Opened for Lonesome Strangers, who I don't know if you're familiar with, but they had a couple albums on the High Tone label. Mm-hmm. And they were kind of this, I guess they call it cowpunk kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
That was a big thing in the 80s, you know.
Yeah, sure.
And the Blasters and Rosie Flores, Dwight Yoakam was just starting to... And then they had all this... There was another name. They were kind of these, you know, sort of psychedelic something bands. I don't know. Like, and there were bands like the Long Riders,
Right.
you know, and all that, you know, so...
But
It was a great scene here back then.
Like, were you also playing in places like the Palomino and the Foothill and like some of those
yeah,
the classic honky
I would
tonks?
go, you know, on the night when they had the big, you know, it was broadcast on the radio and what was it called?
The barn dance?
Yes, the barn
yeah.
dance.
Yeah.
And that was the best, craziest scene because everybody would be. It was a scene, you know,
Right.
like you never know who was going to show up. There was a house band, and then they had guest artists, and you know, big name artists. Like that's how I met Mary Chapey Carpenter. She was playing there one night,
Right.
and
Were there any like the old timers, like the, you know, from like the Buck Owens era of country music? Like, were some of those cats still around?
yeah, some of them were, but I don't really remember. It was mostly kind of the younger scene, like
Right.
Dwight and
Yeah,
Dave
yeah.
Alvin, and you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And some of these, you know, country bands from out of, like I think, you know, Dave Alvin was responsible for, you know, kind of discovering or bringing in some of these bands who played out in Orange County. There was this whole, because my boyfriend back then played bass in some of these, well, he was in the Lonesome Strangers.
Yeah, okay.
But then when he wasn't doing that, he would be playing these like country cover bands out in Orange County. They had all these little country bars that if you went to them back then, you could swear you were in Fort Worth, Texas.
Right.
You know,
Right.
it was a really like hardcore, cool country scene
Right. Right.
in
right.
LA back then.
Right, sure.
You know,
It's such a shame that that is so gone.
I know.
now.
And some of those artists made their way eventually into the Hollywood scene,
Right.
you know, where they were discovered and started, you know, that kind of, so it overlapped. It was this really cool overlapping thing that was happening, you know, back then. So anyway, so I got that development deal with Sony, and that's when I wrote pretty much all the albums that ended up on the Rough Trade album.
Okay.
So I did a demo tape, and they passed on me, you know, and because, you know, they didn't know how to market me.
Right.
They
Right.
didn't have, there was
What
no...
little box do you fit in?
Right. It was either country or rock or, you know, whatever. Anyway, because this was like right on the edge of when that whole, the female singer-songwriter thing burst wide open, you know, and,
It's so interesting. I've talked to so many people that were around that scene at that time and got that same thing. Like I interviewed Dwight Yoakam, and he said the same thing, that he, you know,
Really? Yeah.
auditioned for whatever label,
Oh,
and they
yeah.
said, They actually, you know what they said to him? They said, "You're too country."
Yeah, he had a really hard time. And in fact, the Lunch with Strangers, they were booked. They would get booked to go out and open for Dwight, and Dwight would be opening for these straight country and these straight country venues,
Right.
with these Nashville type audiences. And there's the Lunch with Strangers with their cowpunk thing.
Yeah.
So that didn't work. And Dwight's caught in the middle, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, and eventually, he broke through that. But anyway, so, and eventually, I mean, there was a period in LA after I'd been playing around and I was starting to write these songs and all that, some of the labels started sniffing around and the whole thing. But they all passed on me. None of them would sign. I remember having a meeting at High Tone, and he said, well, we already just signed these two bands. One was called 10 Star, who's nobody knows about anymore, and the other one was Cindy Lee Berryhill, who was really good, but she's not really pursuing a music career, full-time anymore. But there's always some excuse, some reason, we already signed enough people and we don't have any room for anybody else right now, blah, blah, blah. I got passed on. Rounder Records came out to see me play. And it was the 4th of July at this place this bar in Hollywood called I think it was called Dobbs or something. And, you just made whatever came in at the door. And some of the Long Rider guys were sitting in with me, and it was just crazy. I didn't have my own band, and different people were sitting in, and the Rounder Records guys were so, that purist thing again. And they said something like, well, we don't think you're ready to go on the road yet, and it's just your stage, it's just not professional enough, that kind of thing.
That's so crazy.
Yeah.
It's so funny to hear that, like, I mean, this is like a really important lesson for any struggling artist out there, that people who make the decisions about whether or not you make it don't know anything most of the time. They can't recognize it.
And if you give into that, I mean, you gotta, and it's hard though, because I remember I got to the point at one point where I was just kind of like, fuck it. I'm going to go back to Texas. I'm just tired of being these guys like, and they come sniffing around and let's have a meeting, but you're not ready yet.
Hollywood loves a meeting. Hollywood loves a meeting. Let's have a meeting to talk about the next meeting we're going to have.
I know, right?
Oh, it's so funny.
And I'll never forget, there was this guy named Peter Philbin who worked at a lot of these labels now have, converged or merged. So,
Right.
But I think it was EMI at the time or something. And so he said, let's have a meeting, and we started talking about my songs. And he said, I think you're really good, but you just need to go back to the drawing board because, your songs most of your songs don't have bridges. And I was like, really? Like, which one? He goes, well, Poniola, Change the Locks. I go, okay. He goes, work on them some more and give me a call. And I was like, okay, see ya, And I immediately went back to my little duplex apartment, $400 a month back then in Silver Lake. And got out my Bob Dylan albums or cassettes, whatever they were, Neil Young, and started looking over the lyrics and going, screw that guy.
Right.
These songs don't have bridge. What the fuck difference does it make?
Half the time, those old folk songs don't even have a chorus. It's just like 13 verses.
I know. So, I mean, one of the songs he was talking about, though, was Change the Locks, which Tom Petty recorded later, much later, and Poniola, which was, I do all the time now live, and so that was a huge turning point, though.
Right.
Because it was
where
like,
you
okay,
understood, like, wait a minute,
I was like, okay, wait a minute, I got to focus here on, let's go back to the artists I love, like Bob and Neil, and look at their stuff and just, screw that guy.
Dig in.
So, and dig
Yeah.
in. And eventually, and, you know, and then it sounds like a Cinderella story, kind of, but you have to remember this came after a lot of, you know, crazy whirlwind of years and, you know, but this guy who was an A&R guy for Rough Trade Records, he got a hold of the demo tape that I'd done for Sony, started floating around, and he ended up getting a copy of it. And I think, oh yeah, there was another band called the Dream Syndicate. Remember that?
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, they were great. Because so I think it was this guy Nicholas Hill was managing the Dream Syndicate. He gave a copy of the tape to Robin Hurley, who heard it and called me and said, you know, I got a copy of your songs, and you know, I played it for Jeff Travis, the owner of Rough Trade, and we love your voice and your songs. Would you like to make a record? And I just went, hell yeah. I mean, you know, but that's because they were a European punk label.
Right.
You know.
Right.
They didn't give a damn about whether a song had bridges, what market did I fit in.
Right.
You know, they said sign the Smiths, and, you know, so they were trying to branch out.
Right.
And they were going through this period where they wanted to start, you know, looking into different, you know, American artists. And so that's when I got picked up by Rough Trade, which is the best. And that just changed everything,
Right.
you know.
And then, but you now, am I right in thinking that you did that record on Rough Trade?
Right.
And then was the next one on a...
Well, then, you know, that was when the labels, everything started going crazy.
Right.
This was the late 80s, early 90s. And, you know, labels were folding. And, well, actually, I mean, what happened was, you know, so that album came out, and then the press went crazy, and there was all this, where have you been all this time, you know, kind of thing.
She's a
You know?
genius. She doesn't have bridges in her songs.
Yeah. Yeah. And they were all, you know, like, and I mean, it was just turned my life around, you know. And
right.
Rough Trade, they were completely strictly indie label. And they sent me to Europe, you know, for the first time to tour, and I was touring and wearing out my voice and having to do interviews on the same day I had gigs, and, you know, eventually I lost my voice on that first tour because I wasn't prepared, you know.
Right, yeah.
And everything. Well, then I got the attention. Now the major label comes.
Ah.
It goes, oh, you know, whereas before they'd all, you know, and it was RCA.
Okay.
And Bob Buziak, who is a really cool guy. He was a major label guy with an indie outlook,
Right,
you know.
right.
And so he wanted to sign me, and, you know, I was really torn, and I ended up, so I left Rough Trade and went, only because of Bob Buziak.
Right.
But I was real paranoid about doing anything with the major label. But I went with them because of him. And then he had a falling out with the guy who ran the label, and so he left and took all the cool people with him. And then,
The classic major
and then
label story.
The classic
Yeah.
shift. And
Yeah.
there I am stuck at the label with this new, okay, you're going to love this. So the new A&R guy who was appointed, he was like the head of A&R for the whole West Coast for RCA Records. And so this is like right before, you know, the Sweet Old World album, and which was supposed to come out on RCA. And so anyway, long story short, we're having a rehearsal, and, you know, the guy's there, the A&R guy, and we're talking about producers, and I said, well, you know, I want to do a record like, you know, Bob Johnson, you know, that kind of thing. And I just said Bob Johnson. I didn't say Bob Dylan. You know, I said Bob Johnson, who, of course, recorded the 2 eponymous Dylan albums in the 60s. And he said, who's Bob Johnson? I said, well, you know, he recorded Blonde on Blonde. And he goes, oh, is that a band? I swear to God. And the guys and I, at this
You're like,
point,
oh no.
we're all looking at each other, and I'm going, this guy's credibility is shot with me. I mean,
Right.
I can't work with this. This is ridiculous, you know? And
Yeah.
so, you know, I immediately started trying to get off the label. Let me go. I
Right,
don't want to
right.
be here anymore.
Yeah.
Let me off the train, you know?
Yeah.
Because Bob Buziak had been replaced by this Nashville numbers guy, you know,
Right,
the whole
right.
thing. So anyway, I finally got off of that label, and I followed Bob Buziak over to Chameleon, which is part of Elektra.
Right.
And, you know, then we started again working on the Sweet Old World album. And then one day I got up and my manager said, well, Chameleon's folded.
Oh my God.
They're no longer, you know, so now I'm looking for another label.
I mean, it's funny because I was going to ask you about some of the gaps between
See,
your
that's the
records, but
thing,
like this is a
that's
crazy
why
story.
People don't understand what was going on.
Right. Right.
You know.
Yeah.
And so that's what made everything dragging on and on.
Right.
You know, I should have never left Rough Trade Records. I should have stayed with them. But so now here comes, so Chameleon's gone. And so now here comes Rick Rubin. And he's interested. He's got his label, American
Right.
Records. So, no, wait a minute. Let me go back. Sweet Old World did come out on Elektra. It ended up coming out on the Elektra label. Okay, so now the Sweet Old World album's out, which kind of fell through the cracks. And then I started looking. So then Rick Rubin and American Records, and that was what Car Wheels was supposed to come out on Rick's label.
Oh, okay.
But then what started happening with him was he got stuck in this, everything fell through the cracks because everything got held up. The album had been done at this point, finally, but it was held up for a year because Rick was in between changing distribution, trying to decide between Warner Brothers and Sony, and everything was getting held up. And my manager was begging and pleading, please, we got to put this album out. Please let it go, let it go. And we had Danny Goldberg was running the label that will eventually it became the label that was behind Lost Highway.
Okay.
Now I'm getting confused.
There's too many labels
There's
to
too
keep
many
track of.
damn-
I bet this makes you really happy that you have your own label.
I
now.
know, right? That's the thing. Anyway, long story short, my manager appealed to Rick Rubin by saying, one time on the phone, my late manager, Frank Kalari, he said, dude, because, you know, my lawyer had been on the phone with it. He wasn't responding to any of that. But then my manager said, Rick, dude, this is about, like, you got to look at it from your third eye, man. This is like, you know, you got to do the right thing, dude.
Right.
And then Rick went, okay, you know, like, that's how you
We'll
had to
let her
talk
go.
with him.
Right.
You know, you couldn't do the business-these thing with him. He
Right,
didn't
right.
respond to that, you know.
Just meet him at his yoga class. Bring your chakra beads.
Exactly, yeah.
And so, of course, when that record did come out, I mean, that was
Yeah.
obviously a huge turning point in your
Yeah,
career and
that was the next big
the breakthrough.
turning point.
Right.
But the first one was the Rough Trade
Hmm.
album, really. I mean, you know.
Well, how was that for you when Car Wheels did finally come out? And, you know, obviously did really well and,
Yeah.
like, you know, put you on the map.
Yeah,
Like, it was- that was-
basically did.
like, how did you handle that success?
It was just, I mean, you know, I think because it wasn't an overnight thing. So, you know, it was just, I mean, I still had my little fear things, and I still do, just in terms of, you know, getting stuff done. I can remember an incident where I was trying to decide on a photograph for the cover of Car Wheels, and it was getting to the point where everybody was saying, you got to make a decision, Lou, come on. And my lawyer got on the phone with me, and she said, God damn it, Lou, I don't care if this thing comes out in a brown paper bag. We got to put it out. Come on, you know. So there's still those kinds of little things, you know. I get too hung up on little small issues like that. I remember being in the studio with Steve Earle, and he said one time, he goes, Lou, it's only a record. Okay.
Yeah.
You know,
It is funny though, like what you're talking about, like artwork and photos. Those are the things that'll hang you up.
You know,
Yeah.
Because I see some of these other album covers, and I'm just like, God.
Plus, those are things that
Yeah.
those things that are so big to you. Like,
Yes.
I always run that kind of stuff by my wife because she doesn't have
Right.
any of the baggage
Right,
that I have with it.
right.
And so if
It's
she
great to
signs
have
off, I'm
somebody
like,
like-
okay, good. I don't need to
Yeah,
worry about this
yeah.
anymore.
Right.
Because it's all for me. It's just
Yes.
up in my head.
Because I get like that too, and you need that one person
Right.
who you can trust to
Yeah.
go, yes, this is good.
This person
or,
has better taste than me. I'm just going to defer to them.
Yes.
Why do you think that record resonated and continues to resonate with people so much? Like, what was different about that?
Well, you know, I had a lot of time in between Sweet Old World and Car Wheels to work on those songs, but I was touring at the same time. But I think a lot of it maybe because, you know, it's a very narrative kind of album. Like the songs all tell stories, most of them, like Lake Charles, Drunken Angel, you know. I don't know. It's hard for me as the artist to know why, you know, try to
Right,
figure out
right.
why something,
Yeah, sure.
you know.
Well, it's interesting,
mean-
you know. So there was obviously, like we just talked about, there were like, you know, business issues and things that created these large
Yeah.
gaps between records. But really, kind of since then, if you
Yeah.
look at your catalog, I mean, you've been like
Right.
prolific.
Well, that's because, I mean, once I got signed with Lost Highway was formed, the idea was that Luke Lewis, who was running Warner Brothers, I think it was Warner Brothers, or in Nashville, you know, because Carwell's had done so well. And it was right around the time of that, and Ryan Adams was, you know, they signed him, and they said, well, you know, let's make a label, let's form a label, you know, which ended up being Lost Highway, to promote this kind of, just for this kind of music. We still didn't have a name, really,
Right.
you know. So that was
It's-
kind of
it's
the
sad to me
idea
that-
behind Lost Highway.
The missed opportunity for the genre was that it could have been called Y'alternative.
Yeah.
I heard that one. I was
right.
like, why wasn't that it? That's the
I know.
best. That's-
Yeah, I
oh.
didn't. They actually asked me during the time I was still living in Nashville all through the '90s, and I got asked to, you know,
Name the
throw
genre.
in. Yeah, and I didn't like the Americana.
Well, when did you notice that there was this scene happening of like, you know, kind of like-minded artists that were operating outside of the country
Yeah.
music mainstream? You know, at what point did you start to
Well-
notice, oh, Uncle Tupelo and Whiskey
Right.
Town and all these bands that
well,
were
the
doing this
thing,
stuff?
I mean, because for me, it was always going on.
Right.
You know, it wasn't anything new. It was just that, you know, now there was kind of a market being created for that kind of stuff. You know.
Yeah.
But you were saying, you know, asking me about the country thing. I was thinking about, because Mary Chapin Carpenter, you know, she wasn't in any way a country artist, but she fell into that marketing thing, you know, as a country artist, whatever. And we went and did a songwriter tour with Chapin and me and Roseanne Cash in early '90s, and that's when Chapin asked me, you know, she said, I want to record your song Passionate Kisses. And her label, she recorded it, and she wanted it to be the first single off her album, and her label said no, because it wasn't country enough, you know. And she said, well, I don't care, I want to release it as a first single. And you know, she stood her ground, and then it came out, and then it won a Grammy for Country Song of the Year, but it wasn't a country song. I mean, you know, so it's just all this whole.
I always ask people that though, like,
Everything-
what makes a country song a country song? It's such
Right.
a, I mean, you know, 50 years ago there was a more defined
you knew what it
structure
was
to
then.
it.
I
But like
mean-
nowadays, like, why is a
Right.
song country
It's-
or not
the whole
anymore?
thing has
you know?
changed. I mean, the
Right.
whole definition of country, it's just, you know, you have to clarify it when you say country, you know.
Right.
I mean, It used to be Hank Williams, and then it became Shania Twain. I mean, it's just not that there's anything wrong with that. The problem I had with Nashville was that, okay, go ahead, have your slick, overproduced albums, and a lot of these artists would be, if once you stripped away all that stuff, they were, pretty good. I mean, I remember listening to Shania Twain's voice once I could decipher it from all of the overproduction, and I was thinking to myself, she's got a pretty cool voice. But it was just the way albums were starting to be produced in Nashville. But what would make me so angry was that, they didn't make room for the other real stuff.
Right.
The country music, corporation is still the same.
Right.
Basically, it's never going to change. I don't think.
Sure.
And they say that, there's this artist cutting edge. No,
right.
I'm sorry.
I mean,
the people they consider cutting edge are still very mainstream.
Sure. I was thinking about that the other night. I don't know if you watched the Grammys, but when Sturgill won Country Record of the Year, I forget exactly what the specification or the category, but it was something like that, like Country Music Record of the Year.
There's so often that happens.
Right, yeah. Somebody squeaks through,
Somebody squeaks through, and,
but does that mean that that other, like-minded artists will also squeak through, or does that mean that mainstream country music will just kind of ape some of the stylistic flourishes of it and apply that to the existing thing,
There's, I don't know it's just, look, it's like probably the craziest Grammy thing that I experienced for myself was when I won a Grammy for Best Female Rock Vocal for my song Get Right With God, which is anything but a rock song. And I remember thinking I was just so honored to have been nominated.
Sure.
But I didn't expect to win. It didn't matter if I won. I was up against Stevie Nicks and Alanis Morissette. And I won. And I could probably hear the other artists at the time, probably them going, what the fuck? Which I've done before. Like, what the fuck?
It's funny at those moments. I remember one year Foo Fighters were nominated in a category that had like Warren Zevon was in there, and it was the year he died. And then there was Springsteen was there. I don't even remember what it was, but it was like you just knew there's no chance.
No way.
But even
you were
still,
so glad you were nominated.
You're happy there, and
in there,
and even up until the moment they announced it, you're kind of like, could we? And then as soon as you hear you're not, you're like, don't look bitter, don't look bitter.
I know.
Smile, don't look bitter. Those things are funny.
It's really
they really
weird.
are funny. It's a fun night out, but it definitely like yanks your it's just a crazy experience. Anywho,
anyway,
can I ask you a little bit about your songwriting? Like your songwriting. I mean, you're of course held in incredible high regard as a songwriter, one of the greatest songwriters that we have. So I'm wondering. If let's just say you were teaching a songwriting workshop or something, what would your advice be to budding songwriters out there? What do you do? What is your actual I'm going to sit down and write a song?
That would be. I've never taught. I've never had. Done that before, and I've always been terrified about the idea of sitting with young budding songwriters trying to figure out how to explain to them what I do, because it's just so organic and spontaneous, and I'm not real disciplined, to tell you the honest truth, and which my husband and manager Tom used to worry about to no end. When we first started living together and then working together, he would say, "You're a songwriter, I don't see you writing, I don't see you doing anything." And I'd be like, "Don't worry about it, it's okay," because I kind of go through kind of spurts. And I don't know how to explain it, but I just, I just kind of get in the mood. And the thing is, I'm not sitting down with a blank piece of paper. I have stuff that I'm always, okay, here's the thing with me. Like, I'm always writing in my head. I'm always, like when we go out and we're at a bar, anywhere, I always have a pen and notepad with me, and I get ideas and I write them down and I keep them in a folder, and so I have this sort of like, my head's always in that space, and then when I get it to a certain, I have this feeling like, okay, I'm in the mood, something, the muse visits me, and then I get my folder out with all my stuff that I'm working on. Like, I have a bunch of songs now that are kind of almost finished or halfway finished, or so I've got a lot of stuff to work off of,
Yeah.
so it's kind of a work in progress thing.
Right.
That's not, I don't know how, I mean, that's not a very good explanation, but
Well, it seems it would appear that you've been working, twice as hard as everybody else lately. Like, I can't remember any artist that I'm real familiar with that's put out 2 double records in a row since like the Clash.
Well, I mean, some of those I didn't write, they weren't
Right.
all. And that's the other thing, when you put them on a CD, then they end up in vinyl, they end up being, like this last one, the only reason it was a double album was because of this one song, Faith and Grace,
The
which
super
ended
long
up
version,
with
right?
super long version,
Yeah.
so it spilled over, so it ended up being, so it wasn't like a conscious effort. We didn't sit down and say, we're going to do it. But
Well, how do you know with your songs, like how do you know, like, okay, this batch is ready, I'm ready to go into the studio and
Right.
make a record? Like, how much do you flesh them out
know
before
what
you
it-
go in with your band? And
a lot of it has to do with the relationship I have with Tom. He's that guy for me.
right,
Like,
that's
You know-
finished, quit tweaking it, let it go.
this is, well, it's more about not quit tweaking it or whatever, but I'll come up with something. I usually work like maybe here at the kitchen table with a little Zoom recorder, put it down. Once I get it to a certain point, I put it down, I take it up to Tom. He listens to it, and then I'll wait for him to come down, and tell me what he thinks.
Yeah.
And if he comes down with a big smile on his face, then I know, okay,
I got something.
this is good.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
But sometimes he'll come down and say, honey, I think this still needs some more work, or it's not, no, this isn't, And sometimes it's something I've been working on for hours and hours.
Right.
So, but it's good to have, you need to have that person to bounce stuff off of like that.
Yeah. I think there's this myth with songwriting that it just like hits you and an inspiration. The words just poured out of me, as fast as I could write them. But that's not really the case most of the time, is it?
I find, I mean, sometimes, there might be a little spurt like that that's a little song or something. But usually I find myself writing probably in the same way that, a journalist would write or a novelist would write, where, you put a bunch of stuff. I initially, I think it's probably a good idea not to worry about any boundaries and just kind of do a stream of consciousness thing, like whatever comes to your head. I just write it. Don't worry about it rhyming or anything yet.
Right.
And, then go back and look at it and see. And then at the same time, I'm, trying to get a little melody thing. And so I kind of do it sort of piece by piece like that, sort of. And they're not always all the same like that come out like that. But I end up really going in and, editing is a lot of it.
Sure.
And just kind of, okay, take this out and let's make this. And then once I figure out a melody, then I sit and work on the phrasing with the lyrics. And then if it feels awkward, then I go in and change some more in the lyrics, so it's kind of this process.
Yeah, it's the funny thing with lyrics, like some words sing and some words don't.
Exactly.
Some vowel sounds don't.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
That's a lot of what it is. Yeah. So, because sometimes I'll hear songs, younger singer-songwriters, and I'll think to myself, that's, they didn't work on that enough or something, like it's not quite there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
I believe you, man. I think that all the time when I go back and listen to my stuff from just a few years ago.
Yeah.
It's like it's songs are never really done. They're just like where they were that day.
Yeah. There's sort of a feeling that I get. It's almost a physical thing sometimes when I'm working on a song, and if it's a particularly kind of sad song or something, I actually kind of cry, a little, like I kind of get real emotional, and this thing in me just kind of wells up, and that's when I know that I have some,
Right.
that's another way I know.
Do they do that to you when you're on the road and doing them night? Like, do you feel like you need to go to that place when you're performing?
Sometimes. Yeah, when I'm performing, as much as I can.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
Well,
Well, look, I don't want to take any more of your time. You've been so generous to let
No
me come to your
problem.
house and on Valentine's Day.
been
Right?
great.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much.
Thank
I really,
you.
really appreciate it. It's been great.
Thank you.
All right, that was Lucinda Williams on Walking the Floor. Make sure you get on over to lucindawilliams.com. Check out her tour dates. Check out what she's up to. She's got a great record that she put out not too long ago called The Ghosts of Highway 20. Make sure you listen to that. You can find her on Twitter. Let's see, her Twitter handle is @HappyWoman9. I don't know what that means, but I don't care. It's Lucinda frickin' Williams, people. Come on. Get on over there. And while you're doing that, make sure you go listen to all the old Walking the Floor interviews in the iTunes store. There's a million of them to choose from. And we will be back in a week with another fine episode for you to listen to on your long, long commute to wherever the hell you're going. All right, that's it. Adios, amigos!
You chew tobacco, spit out in a can.